It doesn't come out of the sky. It comes from the electric company, which is probably burning coal or diesel to get your electricity. Whereas here, it comes from the sun. It goes into the Tesla battery. So it's zero carbon footprint. So I don't put up with anything from Greta Thunberg because my carbon footprint is lower than hers.
Yeah. Like I said, a lot of people wouldn't guess this, but it's, when it comes down to the details, it's like, we don't want boondoggle, subsidy driven, bad solar, but if it's good, efficient solar for the right application, we love it.
Right. So, and I also want to put a disclaimer. My solar panels come from Canada, not China. So
see, it's all, the good thing is here on Rickards Uncensored, everything is uncensored. We get you into the points that matter. And these things, as I know, Jim, you're the real deal. And everything's very detailed, data oriented. So we love that about you. But
I ain't buying no Chinese panels. They're all from Canada.
All right, let's get started here. Real quick, as always, I want to go down the agenda. We've got a bunch of, Jim said in the green room, we might have 3 hours of conversation here, but we're going to try and cram it into the hour that we've got. We want to talk about Ukraine because tons of stuff there happening, a lot of new things. Jim's going to dive in. We want to talk about, obviously, debt ceiling, what's happening there. And then we've got some news out of China with some loans. It's more of like a global picture, big picture thing. So we'll see if we can get to that. If we can get past there, 3 hours of content into one, then we might cover a little bit. Jim's got some new takes on AI and then some maybe a tease for the upcoming strategic intelligence issue. The other thing we'll do is a quick disclaimer. On the call today, we might be talking about investing. It should go without saying that all investing has risk, and nothing that Jim or myself cover on the call should be considered personalized investment advice. Everything here is for the group. So let's kick it off, Jim. We're a little bit isolated here in the US. We see our own problems and we've got our own media and stuff, but the war in Ukraine, it's sort of getting muffled a little bit, but it's still going on in big picture stuff there. So let's get everyone caught up. What does everyone need to know? What's the latest update from Ukraine?
Well, you're absolutely right, Matt. What's going on now is more critical than things that have happened earlier, but in some ways getting less attention in the United States. That's just a media filter being applied. The best advice I can give to anyone, any listener interested in Ukraine, is do not believe anything you read in the New York Times, the Washington Post, mainstream media, anything coming out of NBC News, etc. Don't believe it. And that's not like a generic, oh, they're all biased kind of thing. That is very, very specific advice. They are acting as propaganda outlets. In the case of the New York Times, probably the State Department. In the case of the Washington Post, the CIA, mainstream media, the White House. They're putting out a constant stream of propaganda to prop up the Ukrainian narrative. What is the Ukrainian narrative? Well, it's basically Russia, the bad guys, they invaded. Putin's a thug. Russian morale is low. Troops are deserting. They can't maintain their positions. Putin's probably going to get, assassinated or run out of town, etc. And all we have to do is keep sending more arms, more money to the Ukrainians, and they'll eventually win and take back Crimea, etc., and live happily ever after. That's the narrative. Now, what's the point of that narrative? Well, first of all, it keeps the arms industry going. These, you hear about 10 billion, 20 billion, upwards of 100 billion now, more, getting closer to $200 billion of aid to Ukraine. Well, those numbers are true, but a lot of that aid comes from the United States taking its armaments, taking its basically reserves of ammunition, missiles, Patriot missile system, HIMARS, guided artillery, et cetera, and sending it to Ukraine. So you take the cost of that and say, well, that's how much we're giving them dollar-wise. What we're really giving them is a lot of surplus stuff, not always the best stuff, not always the newest stuff. But remember that when the war started, the theory was, well, maybe we're not going to march to Moscow, but we can fight and we can deplete the Russians. That we're going to bleed the Russians, their troops, weapons, arms, money, etc. And eventually they're weak and they'll become weak and they'll fall, and we're going to march. Then we'll march into Moscow and get rid of Putin once and for all. In fact, the exact opposite has happened. Russia has put its economy on a war footing. What does that mean? You devote all your industrial resources, all your inputs, all your labor, intellectual property, et cetera, to winning the war, producing weapons, et cetera. They've had several mobilizations, call it a draft, to call it what you want, but basically calling up reserves, calling up enlisting more troops, on a draft basis. I'm not saying this is all voluntary, to resupply the Russian divisions and troops in Ukraine. Who's getting bled? The United States is. We are not on a war footing. So therefore, our arms industries, you say, well, what's the big deal? Call up and order some more Patriot missiles. Good luck with that. We have what we have, but those assembly lines one by one have been shut down. Can you gear them up again? Yes, but that takes years. That's not like pushing a button. It's not an overnight process. Ammunition stocks are running low. Our deficit, I mean, that we can talk about that later, but that's a complete joke, where we're running, multi-trillion-dollar deficits year after year. Who knows how long that can go on, but obviously Ukraine is not helping that. And so we're the ones being bled financially, militarily, ammunition systems, et cetera. Number one. Number two, one of the things this war has revealed, the United States, we fought in Afghanistan, we fought in Iraq, et cetera. I'm not denigrating the bravery of the men and women who were on the front lines. I mean, of course, they were heroic in their own way, but they're basically kicking down doors in, mud villages. What's going on in Ukraine? This is an urban 21st century war of certainly sophisticated weapon systems of a kind we haven't seen since the end of World War II. Okay, Korea, but certainly in Europe has seen nothing like this since the end of World War II, and Russia's winning. So what's happening with the Patriot missiles? Well, the Russians have destroyed 1/3 of the Patriot missile capacity that we sent to Ukraine. How'd they do that? I mean, the Patriot missile, what is it? It's an anti-missile missile. It's a missile that goes up and shoots down an incoming missile. Well, the Russians have a missile that's hypersonic. I mean, which means hypersonic just means faster than the speed of sound, but think 3, 4, 5 times faster than the speed of sound. These things are coming in from the edge of space, and the Patriots can't shoot them down. The Russians have surpassed the technology of the United States. Their offensive weapon is so fast and so sophisticated that our defensive weapon can't stop it. As a result, the Patriots are being blown up. The HIMARS, they work pretty well, actually, but they rely on a GPS signal, a microwave or electronic transmission to tell the missiles where to go. They're guided missiles, artillery, but a kind of like a cruise missile shot out of a cannon, if you will. Well, the Russians have figured out how to jam the system, and that was jam the signal. So the missile gets fired, but the Russians jam it, doesn't get the coordinates, it doesn't really know where it's going, kind of falls harmlessly. So those systems are now obsolete, and the Russians will very quickly start selling that technology to any enemy of the United States. So query whether the HIMARS are not just obsolete, along with the Patriots. Now, and we keep sending these miracle weapons, game changer. Here come the HIMARS, here come the Patriots, here come the Javelins, etc. We're either running out of them, or they don't work as expected because the Russians have more sophisticated weapon systems against them, or in the case of the HIMARS, the jamming system. So what's the new miracle weapon? Oh, the F-16s. Okay, good luck learning to fly an F-16 in less than a year and a half. Yeah, the pilots are being trained, I think, in San Diego. They're being trained in the UK and elsewhere in Europe. Poland's assisting, but to take a Ukrainian pilot who's been flying an obsolete MiG, which is a Russian model, an obsolete MiG fighter for however long they've been flying, 10 years or longer, and then say, okay, now you're going to fly an F-16. You got to almost start from scratch. The F-16 is highly sophisticated. And they say it takes about a year in the United States anyway for U.S. pilots, Top Guns, if you will. It takes about a year and a half to really get trained, and then maybe another year or longer to become highly proficient, where you're lethal, you're deadly, and you're going to win a dogfight. Well, they don't have that much time. They haven't spent that much time yet. Maybe they know how to switch it on and take off and fly around a little bit, but that's not the same as being anywhere close to a lethal pilot or a lethal system. And the Russians have systems and their own aircraft, more sophisticated, which can probably shoot them down. If you don't shoot them down on the ground, I mean, they're sitting around some airbase somewhere. So what are they going to do? Take off from Poland? Okay, well, that's World War III, because Poland's a NATO power. The Russians would be justified in attacking Poland, and then under Article 5 of the Articles of NATO, that attack on one is an attack on all. Would that qualify if the Poles started it? Because, et cetera, because they have the bases. You're going to land these things in Ukraine, well, the Russians will blow up the airfield. So there's a lot of propaganda. There's a lot of talk. We just saw the end of the Battle of Bakhmut in near the Donbass region. It's sort of between the Donetsk or Luhansk and Donetsk, a little bit further north of that line of control, and as part of a Russian advance on other key cities in the Donbass region. It kind of reminds me of Gettysburg in the sense, like, why was the Battle of Gettysburg so important? Gettysburg was a small, out of the way town. It wasn't like taking Richmond or trying to take Washington, et cetera. Why was Gettysburg so important? Well, the answer was, if you look at a map, it was in the middle of a network of about 10 different roads. So if you were going from, Baltimore to Harrisburg, or you were going from West Virginia to Philadelphia, if you were traveling any distance in that part of the country, you went through Gettysburg. It was a big crossroads. And of course, it was in the north. So this was Lee's last throw of the dice to try to capture a critical hub. And then from there, if he had won the Battle of Gettysburg, he might have been able to advance to Philadelphia or Baltimore, or even Washington. And he did. So Bakhmut kind of occupies that position, not critical in and of itself, but a critical crossroads. Now the Russians have it. And so what are the Ukrainians saying? Well, they destroyed the city, which is true. I mean, it's pretty much rubble. So it's like a Pyrrhic victory. Well, no, not really, because you do have control over it. There is infrastructure there, and you can start to rebuild it. So that's not the same as saying it's a wasteland. And if it was so unimportant, why did the Ukrainians fight to the death? The Ukrainians took horrendous casualties, in the tens of thousands of dead. Now, very hard to get the exact numbers, but 50,000 dead would not be a stretch, and the Russian casualties were nowhere near that. So all the happy talk you're hearing, I'll single out the New York Times, but the same would be true of a lot of other major, big city newspapers and outlets. Just don't believe it. I mean, now, why do I know so much and the New York Times doesn't? Well, the New York Times might, but they're not being honest about it. It's very, very difficult from an intelligence gathering point of view to get good sourcing on this. In other words, are the people out there who know what they're talking about, or are in touch with people on the ground who are not Russian propagandists, but they're not American or US propagandists either? They're just good analysts trying to get it right. Well, the answer is there are a few. And, I think a lot of people may be familiar with Colonel Douglas McGregor, Scott Ritter, ex-Marine, among the United States commentators, but there are others. Alexander Mercurius, you can find him on Rumble, and a program called the Duran, which is, again, very plugged in. Mercurius in particular, he's kind of like the drudge of Ukraine. He's in London. He's not in Ukraine, but he has a huge network of sources because he's become a go-to place. People are giving him intelligence, giving him information. He's very good at filtering. Every now and then he makes a mistake. He's the first. He'll come on this next broadcast or podcast and say, you know what, I got this wrong. Here's the right story. Just sorry, let's correct it. So yeah, everyone makes mistakes when you're reporting in from a battle space. But he's very honest about it. So I admire that. And there are other sources out there, some on Twitter, some on Telegram, which is another media channel. But it's taken me a long time to identify all these sources that I feel I can rely on. Look, this is bloody, hard fought, tragic, never should have happened. The war should be ended as quickly as possible. There should be peace. The Russians have tried to have peace talks, but nobody wants to talk to them. So, okay, let's keep fighting. It's kind of what the West is saying. You got all these warmongers in Washington. So it's going badly for Ukraine. It's a tragedy. It's going badly for U.S. policy because we're propping up Ukraine. We're hurting ourselves. We're depleting our own military stores. Far from depleting the Russians, we're depleting ourselves. Where are we going to be if there's trouble in Taiwan or Middle East or anywhere else in the world? The expense is horrendous. And I should pivot a little bit to the financial sanctions. Like, well, okay, tough battle on the ground, but aren't we winning the war of financial sanctions? Aren't we crushing the Russian economy? No, the Russian ruble is about. I checked Reuters the other day or yesterday. It's right where it was when the Russians invaded. It's about 80 rubles to the dollar, but that's where it was on February 22nd, 2022 when the Russians invaded, and that's where it is today. Yeah, it went down a little bit at the beginning, rallied back, went up. It's in a range, but the ruble. Remember Biden said we're going to crush the ruble, we're going to kick him out of SWIFT, we're going to kick him out of the banking system. And said none of that has happened. I mean, they were kicked out of SWIFT, but they built a new payments channel with the Chinese. They were kicked out of the banking system, but they've got their own. Like I said, they've got their own banking channels with the Indians, the Brazilians, the Chinese, etc. Their reserve position is fine. They were very smart. Avila Nabulina, who's the head of the central bank of Russia, spent 15 years building up their gold reserves. They have about $150 billion in gold, roughly 3,000 metric tons. And gold is not something you can freeze. You can't kick Russia out of the gold system. It's gold. It's in a vault. It's sitting there near Moscow, and we can't do anything about it. And you say, well, you can't wire it, et cetera. So the ruble
There's
is
that ruble
doing.
chart if you wanted to see it, Jim.
Yeah.
Again, so this is before. Over here, we're before anything in the war. This is February 2022, and then
Right.
Whenever those, obviously we spiked the ruble at one point, and then but it's all right back to normal.
Yeah, well, that's an inverted scale. So when you see the spike, it means the ruble's collapsing. So it went from, that's like rubles per dollar. That's the scale. So that spike means that
that makes
ruble,
sense. Yeah, I should have pulled,
that's okay. It's just the way
ruble.
just wanted to explain how the scale works. So the spike is it went to 125 rubles per dollar, which means it did go down very sharply right after the war. That lasted about a minute. And then you see what happened next. It rallied all the way back close to 50. In fact, in the summer of 2022, you look at that July dip. The dip is actually a very strong ruble. At that point, it's July 2022. That dip is a very strong ruble. That's about almost 50 to the dollar, which is stronger than it was before the war started. And Nabulina actually raised interest rates because she was worried that the ruble was too strong. And then that works. So, but if you look at where it is now, 80, you've got that green flag there. And go back to February 2022, just before the spike. Where is it? 78, 77, 78. It's right where it was. So nothing happened to the ruble, like a panic spike. Then it got too strong and then it came back. So the point is, we didn't crush the ruble. We didn't kick Russia out of the financial system. They're actually inventing and creating their own financial system, non-dollar based, with China, with India, with Brazil, Turkey, Iran, Central Asian countries, Belarus, et cetera. Other countries that are either on Russia's side or they're neutral. I mean, I'm not saying India is rooting for a Russian victory in Ukraine. What I'm saying is India is sitting this one out. They're not taking side. And by the way, they're buying Russian oil like it won't quit. So all the oil, well, Europe's not buying any Russian oil. Well, fine. We'll sell it to China, India, and they are. Slight discount, but not a big one. And of course, there's they're getting paid in dollars, believe it or not, which they can then convert to other currencies. Sometimes they get paid in Indian rupees and Chinese yuan, but they can then use that money to buy products from China. So China sells them, semiconductors or things that the West won't sell them, or manufactured goods or weapons. Iran sells them drones, et cetera. India, okay, they built up a rupee balance to some extent, but there's technological goods and other things that they can buy from India, or you can sell the rupees on foreign exchange markets and try to get euros or yuan or Japanese yen or something else, and then use that in trade. Look, it's clunky. I'm not saying it's cost free. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is it's far from any kind of death blow to the Russian economy. In fact, the Russian economy is performing about on a par with the U.S. economy today. We just got updated first quarter GDP numbers for the U.S. And I know we're 2/3 of the way through the second quarter, but first quarter looks like it was around 1.1 or 1.2% on an annualized basis. Well, Russian growth is about the same. So yeah, I'm sure both countries wish they had higher growth, but nobody's getting crushed here. Certainly not the Russians. So the reserve position's intact, largely because they were smart enough to get into gold. By the way, quick aside, Matt, everyone's talking about the debt ceiling today, and if we don't raise the debt ceiling, the U.S. is going to default on its debt, et cetera. That's never happened. Nonsense. It happens all the time. The U.S. froze the Russian position in U.S. Treasury securities. I said they had a lot of gold. Russia has a lot of gold, and they do, but they also had over $100 billion of U.S. Treasury securities, which are not paper certificates. They used to be in the 1970s, but it's all digital. The ledger is controlled by the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury. So those have been frozen. So Russia bought U.S. Treasury securities, paid dollars for them. They're entitled to principal and interest on an ongoing basis, principal at maturity, et cetera. And the U.S. is not paying them. We're not paying the principal. We're not paying the interest. That's a default. Now, it's a selective default. It's like, hey, Russia, you're not getting your money. Hey, rest of the world, no worries. You're fine. It's what credit, it's what S&P or Moody's or Fitch ratings would call selective default, but it's still a default. I could give many other examples, by the way, but so don't tell me the U.S. doesn't default on its debt. We froze Russia and we're not paying them, so that's a default. But that aside, Russia is doing fine. And one thing they have done that we have not done is they've mobilized for war. They're now on a war footing, and the U.S. is not, and that's why our weapons are being depleted. So now, what's the buzz? The buzz is everyone's waiting for the Ukrainian offensive, this big Ukrainian offensive. Ukraine's been gathering its strength, getting some tanks from Poland and Germany and a few other places, mobilizing forces. They've been training sometimes outside of Ukraine. They're concentrating, they're ready to punch through the Russian lines. I'm sorry, the Russians have built up fortifications and defensive lines that are with 3 times the troops. They had a year to do it. They've got 3 times the troops that the Ukrainians have. By the way, just kind of tactics, or strategic thinking 101. If you're the defender, generally it's assumed that the attacker, which would be Ukraine in this case, has to outnumber you kind of 3 to 1, maybe 4 or 5 to 1. This is the Colin Powell doctrine, but it's as old as history. Everyone knows the attacker needs a lot more. Well, here the attacker has less. The Russians outnumber the Ukrainians 3 to 1, and that's just in Ukraine. And that's not to say the Russians couldn't send more. They probably will if they have to. But they've got tank brigades. Well, you need about 300 tanks in a brigade. They've got 50 or 60. So they're not up to full strength. It's very difficult to resupply them because Russia's degraded the infrastructure. They're the ones, a lot of them are raw recruits. They've been dragging them out of Western Ukraine, putting them in uniform, giving them a 6-week training course and putting them on the front lines where they're getting slaughtered by the Russians. Pardon me. So the point being, all the happy talk you're hearing out of Washington and the media is not true. The best sources, and I mentioned some of the names, and there are others, say that if Ukraine does launch an offensive, they'll be annihilated. And if they don't, then Russia will continue to control the territory, and Russia will eventually launch its own offensive. And everyone says, well, what happened to the Russian offensive of the winter? Russia was supposed to have this big offensive last winter. Well, why would you go on offensive if the Ukrainians are attacking you and you're slaughtering them, which they were annihilating the Ukrainians, we know, with artillery and better intelligence and precision missiles, et cetera. If the Ukrainians are attacking you and you're slaughtering them, why would you go on the attack? Just sit there and let them keep coming and keep killing them, which is what the Russians did. So the Ukrainian forces in that sense are badly depleted. So the Russia's winning on the ground. Russia's not only surviving but thriving in a new world, a new economic world that we forced them to create. I've said often, I said this in the Pentagon and the CIA. I don't think our enemies can destroy the dollar, but we can do it ourselves. With poor leadership and misguided policies, the U.S. is now pretty far down the road of destroying the dollar. We've weaponized it. We have weaponized the dollar. It's not working, but we have given the rest of the world a pretty strong incentive to come up with an alternative. It's like, hey, if you're going to use the dollar as a weapon against me, then I'm out of the dollar. I'm going to get something else. That kind of, when we talk more about that, that kind of gets us to the new BRICS currency, which is coming in August. We'll be talking a lot more about that and writing about that. So you'll see that in upcoming issues of some of our main publications. So short answer, Matt, Russia's winning on the ground. Look, this is slow, brutal, and tragic. I'm not, this is not a paper, war game or, kind of laboratory war game situation, but Russia's winning. They're going to keep winning because they're mobilized. We're being depleted economically and militarily. And the American people are basically being lied to. So, and then the sanctions are not working, and it's driving the rest of the world towards de-dollarization.
Yeah. All right. Why don't we stick on that topic? I'll throw you another one here just for what you're thinking prediction wise, like what happens next. And I don't know if you want to go further into it, but like, let's think about it in chunks, like over the summer or in between now and September. And then maybe the second chunk is like, what happens in the winter? If you just had to throw a prediction out there or a guess, like, what do you think is going to happen next that folks on the call today can be aware of, or if we're investing around it, where do you think this goes?
Well, I think the Ukrainians will launch this offensive. Now, militarily, they shouldn't. They're not prepared for it. They're, as I said, they're badly outnumbered. And pardon me, Russia's in a position to surge whatever. You go back to again, I'll keep referring to the Battle of Gettysburg. One of the reasons the North won, the Americans won against the Confederates, is they kept a reserve. And General Meade, was kind of surveying the battlefield, and the Confederates would attack in different places, and he would just watch the battlefield. And if he saw the Confederates were making progress in a particular point, he would surge his reserve to that point instead of just sending them out there generically. He kept, that's the point of a reserve. He held them back until he saw the Confederates making progress. Then he would send the reserves, and the Confederates would be driven back. That was on day 2 before you get to Pickett's charge on day 3. The Russians will do something similar to that in the case of a Ukrainian offensive. So here come the Ukrainians again. They're not fully provisioned. They don't have the armor they need. The Patriot missiles don't work. The HIMARS don't work because of the GPS interference. They don't have the F-16s yet, and they're out of ammo. I mean, all this hardware, all these big, cannons and artillery pieces and launchers and all this stuff. What good does it do if you don't have artillery, if you don't have the ammunition, you don't have the shells, and they're running low on those. We can't make them fast enough. I mean, we're calling up South Korea saying, hey, you got any ammunition you can send to Ukraine? And South Korea said, yeah, we got some. And they're sending it to the US, and the US is sending it to Ukraine. Very clunky progress. So the question is, strategically, why would you launch this offensive if you're not ready, if you're outnumbered, and you're probably going to get slaughtered? The answer is we have a not very bright warmonger in the State Department, Tony Blinken. We have another, not too bright warmonger as National Security Advisor in the form of Jake Sullivan. We have a super warmonger in the form of Victoria Nuland, who's the Deputy Secretary of the State. And we have a brain dead president, a president who, if I were his lawyer, I wouldn't let him sign a contract because he's what the Latin phrase is non compos mentis, which means you can't think straight. You can't make a real decision, is sitting in the Oval Office. So with a vacancy at the center of leadership, a bunch of warmongers around them, they're pushing the Ukrainians to do this. They want the Ukrainians to do this. Why? It keeps up the narrative. This is like, oh, what do we care? Do we care about people being killed on the battlefield and actually what's going on? Or do we care about a narrative that we can spoon feed the American people? Well, the answer is they want the narrative. And so if Ukraine does not go on the offensive, Americans are going to say, maybe things aren't going so well over there. So the idea is to launch this thing no matter what. Hopefully, is the cavalry going to arrive in time in the form of F-16? So every one of these weapon systems we sent them ends up failing. I don't think the F-16s will be any better. I don't think they're ready. May not be for another year. But they just, the expression, it's tragic, but it's true. America's going to fight to the last Ukrainian. Ukrainians are being slaughtered, and like, hey, keep going, guys. Just charge in there, fight the Russians. They're going to get slaughtered again. Eventually, okay, so I expect the Ukrainians will launch the offensive, not soon, meaning maybe in a matter of weeks or less, maybe in days. Not because it makes sense, but because American warmongers want them to do it. They will be annihilated, at which point Russia will go on the offensive, and maybe not till late summer or fall. But the point being, there comes a time when the strategy just the Russians have what they call crumple zones, which is the Russians surge a little bit, and then the Ukrainians fight back, and then the Russians retreat. They actually, this is what Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse did to Custer. They retreat, and in come the Ukrainians, like, hey, we got them on the run, but it's a trap. You want them to come into the crumple zone, then you bombard it with artillery and annihilate them. So these little surges are just teases, and the Ukrainians say, oh, we got them, and here they come, and the Russians pull back, and then here comes the artillery, and they get wiped out. They'll be doing things like that, encirclements, etc. But at some point, the Ukrainians will be so depleted, and I would expect that to be the case after this spring, maybe now winter offensive, and that at that point the Russians will go on the offensive. Not yet. They gotta fend off and annihilate the Ukrainians who will foolishly go on the offensive. So you're going to hear a lot of hoopla, and again, banner headlines in the New York Times. Ukraine is attacking. Ukraine's going to retake the land bridge. Ukraine's on the way to Mariupol. They're going to get you Crimea. Those will be the headlines. They'll all be lies. The Russians will annihilate them, and then maybe by the fall, the Russians will go on the offensive, and they'll take Zaporizhzhia, and maybe retake Kherson, and then with the ultimate prize being Odessa. And at that point, there's nothing to do. And everyone said, well, why don't the Ukrainians have some peace talks? Well, that might not be a bad idea, but they haven't. They've been told by the West, you have to keep fighting. And at this point, is Russia going to give back any of the gains? No. Why should they? I mean, they've suffered casualties. They've incurred expenses. They've fought hard. Why on earth would you sign a peace deal today that gives back what you spent the last year and a half fighting over? They won't. And so the best deal, you already hear this coming out of the foreign policy establishment. Gee, how about a freeze? Time out, blow a whistle, time out. Just everyone stay where you are, which is what happened in Korea, by the way. The Korean War is not over. There was never a peace treaty in 1953. It was an armistice, which means time out, stop shooting. And that has held for 70 plus years. But there was never a peace treaty in Korea. So something like that, I don't know. I read all these fantasies, let's give Ukraine the Israel deal. The Israel deal is, you're not in NATO, you're not in a formal alliance, but we're going to act as if you are and keep supplying you with weapons, and we don't have to do it with annual appropriations. We'll just keep sending them. Really? I mean, is that Ukraine's lost a war, but we're going to keep sending them weapons? At least the Israelis win when they fight. Give them credit for that. So our diplomacy is disastrous because we don't have any really serious thinkers involved. Our military is failing because we haven't upgraded our weapon systems, and we're running down our supplies. So Russia's going to keep winning. So to answer your question, Matt, the question is, at what point do American policymakers decide, you know what, it's just not worth it. We're not winning. We got to, basically turn tail and run, which is what we did in Afghanistan. But you have to put all this in the context. And this is important. In the context of Biden's failing health, he might, the election debate's interesting for 2024. Biden might die before then. I mean, he's not at all healthy, not even close. But he's certainly getting weaker by the day. That's apparent from his rare appearances. But if the war is going badly for Ukraine, if the U.S. is losing, which we are, if the financial sanctions are not working, if the BRICS come out with a new currency, which we do expect in August, and Russia's on the move, and you're 6 months or 8 months away from an election. And by the way, they've already said Biden won't do debates. Of course, he can't do debates. He can barely talk. This is just going to really destroy confidence in U.S. power, the U.S. dollar, Treasury securities at some point. I mean, it kind of goes from bad to worse. We haven't even talked about the fact that we're probably heading for a very severe recession and a global financial crisis. So it looks like a pretty bleak picture.
Yeah, so things could keep going. And we're the leadership in the US, we're just making, or in retrospect, it's easy to see this too, like just really, really bad decisions. And the people that we have in place there aren't really capable of making the right decisions. They don't know any better. Or to your point of narrative, they're warmongering.
The warmongering with a narrative, which the American people are eating up, but the American people are smarter than that. They're smarter than their own leadership, and there'll come a time when people say, you know what, you're lying to me, and this is just not working. By the way, in a few days, I'm going down to Carlisle, Pennsylvania. I'm teaching a seminar on financial warfare to the U.S. Army War College, but the members of all branches, so there'll be Marines and Navy commanders and Air Force pilots. I actually met the Top Gun once. He was in one of my classes. But the point being, our discussion now for our viewers is kind of a warm up for what I'll be telling the mid-career officers in the Advanced Strategic Arts program at the War College next week.
Awesome. That's what you get here. Rickards Uncensored. You get it ahead of everybody. All right. We're talking deep state. We'll switch gears now, move away from Ukraine, come back to the US. But similar deep state vibes. Let's talk a debt ceiling. Get us caught up here. What's the latest take from your side? Let's assume everyone knows that, we're in this back and forth debt ceiling debate and we don't know where it's going. Let's get everyone caught up.
Yeah, I'll give a quick background or so, because there's a lot of confusion about the debt ceiling and the budget deficit. Now, obviously they're related, but there are two different fights going on. So what is the debt ceiling? The debt ceiling is just a statute. It's a law that Congress says the United States Treasury is not authorized to issue more than a certain amount of debt. Here's the amount of debt you can issue, no more. Now, here's the debt that's outstanding. Now, some of this debt matures. If you have a 2-year note that you issued 2 years ago, it's coming to maturity right now. So the Treasury can issue a new 2-year note to pay off the old 2-year note. They can do that because you're not increasing the ceiling. The total amount of debt outstanding is the same, but they can issue new debt to pay off the old debt. They just can't issue more. Well, guess what? We're running a huge $1 trillion budget deficit. So you have to issue more just to finance the new debt, not even talking about rolling over the old debt. And therefore, the debt ceiling has to be raised. So that's one debate that's going on. At the same time, the job of the Congress is to approve a budget, an annual budget. And by the way, the U.S., why keep it simple, the fiscal year for the United States expires at midnight on September 30th. So we are not on a December 31st, calendar year for budget purposes. Midnight, September 30th is when the budget, all the spending authorizations run out. You've got to get a new budget done before October 1st to keep the government running. And a lot of times what they do is called a continuing resolution, or CR for short. A CR basically says, hey, we haven't figured out the budget yet, but everybody can keep spending what they were spending. We're not authorizing new programs or increasing caps or whatever, but keep doing what you're doing. And that gets you through a few months, because if you're trying to stay below a spending cap, an authorization cap, you're not really going to hit the cap until like June or July of 2024. So that does work as a short run expedient. So we're going to have a budget debate and possible shutdown of the US government at midnight on September 30th. That's different from the debt ceiling debate, which is going on right now. So I just wanted to explain the difference, but obviously the large deficit is forcing us to the debt ceiling, but we have an immediate debt ceiling problem staring us in the face. Now, what is the X date? Some people have heard the reference to the X date. What's the X date? It sounds like the X-Files or something, but the X date is the day when the US Treasury actually goes broke, runs out of money, can't pay the bills. That's the X date. When is the X date? Well, the truth is nobody knows. It's like, you're juggling your household budget. You're like, well, things are a little tight this month. I'll pay the credit cards and the mortgage, but I'm not going to pay the electric bill. If you're living paycheck to paycheck or just trying to get by, you make decisions like that. I'll pay the electric bill next month, let them charge me $5 penalty, whatever it might be. So the US hit the debt ceiling a couple of months ago. We are at the debt ceiling today. So how on earth has the United States government managed to pay its bills since, around April when we hit the debt ceiling until today? Because here we are at the end of May, almost June. Well, the answer is cash flow. Now, even if you can't issue more debt, you might have positive cash flow. Where does that come from? It comes from taxes. On April 15th, that's the tax deadline. So that's called tax season. So a lot of people are paying their taxes. Yeah, there's some refunds, of course, but a lot of people are paying taxes. So the Treasury has positive cash flow, even though they're at the debt ceiling, and they can use that cash to pay some bills. They also have some slush funds. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but there's something called the Exchange Stabilization Fund. It has a history coming back to FDR, but from the profits he made from confiscating the gold from the American people. But it's about $100 billion, and it just sits there and does not require congressional authorization. So you got $100 billion slush fund. You got some positive cash flow. It's kind of like looking in the sofa for nickels and dimes that, people lost and, hey, I got a quarter here. But that's what the Treasury is doing right now. And these are called, the name for it is extraordinary measures, but it's basically, like I say, rooting through the behind the sofa cushions looking for spare change. But there comes a time when that runs out. Even the games and the slush funds and the positive cash flow run out. We're getting very close to that point, and that's the X date. Now, Janet Yellen, who's not that bright when it comes to things like this, I mean, she has a high IQ, but no common sense. About a month ago, she said the X date is June 1st. So why did she do that? I mean, no one knows the exact date. We're getting, there is an X date. We're getting closer. That's true, but nobody knows the exact date. So why pretend? Well, the answer is we have a standoff between the White House and the House Republicans. Remember, the Republicans actually control the House of Representatives. The House Republicans passed a bill, and it does raise the debt ceiling, but it also is a budget bill. They put the debt ceiling bill inside the budget bill and passed both of them in one bill. And that imposes spending cuts on discretionary spending, tries to increase defense spending, by the way. Well, we got a war going on. And does other things, releases some money that's just kind of, there was some COVID money that never got spent. I was like, well, why don't you give it back? And some tax reform, not tax increases, but eliminating some loopholes. It'll raise a little bit of revenue, et cetera. So that was all in this House budget. And Kevin McCarthy, to his credit, got a bunch of, cats and herded them all, and they voted in favor of this. And there are a lot of divisions among the House Republicans. Forget about Republicans, Democrats. Not one Democrat voted for this bill, but the Republicans did. But they stayed together and they got the majority and they passed this bill. But remember, they can only lose 5 votes. If 5 Republicans don't support the leadership, meaning Kevin McCarthy, then the Republicans can't do anything. So this thing's hanging by a thread. So now you've got the White House saying they want a clean debt ceiling bill. Clean means raise the debt ceiling, don't do anything else. We'll deal with the budget. We got all summer, maybe beyond to deal with the budget, but just give us a clean debt ceiling bill. The Republicans are saying, no way, we will give you a debt ceiling bill, but we have a bunch of demands. We want constraints on spending, limits on total debt in the future, et cetera. A lot of detail in there. They want to repeal some of this Green New scam. I almost said Green New Deal. I got to correct myself. Green New scam legislation that Biden and Pelosi pushed through last summer. They want to amend some of that and repeal some of that. So now the White House and the House Republicans are in negotiations. Bearing in mind, Biden's kind of brain dead. He's showing up every now and then, but it's the people around him who are actually calling the shots. McCarthy and his team are in there, but McCarthy's got to watch his back because there's the Freedom Caucus. I forget how many votes they have exactly. It's around 35 or 40, maybe a little less than that. But this is led by the more conservative Republicans, people like Chip Roy and Jim Jordan and Andy Biggs and others in the Freedom Caucus, and they want what they voted for, meaning they want these budget cuts and closing tax loopholes and repealing some of the Green New scam, et cetera. And they're saying we're not voting for any debt ceiling that doesn't include that. The White House is insisting on a clean bill. So they're making progress. But remember the clock's ticking. We're getting closer to the X date. And this is why markets are getting really nervous right now. Until I would say even yesterday, there was a narrative that, yeah, okay, it's messy. Everyone's yelling, screaming, going on TV, but they'll get there. They've raised the debt ceiling many times in the past. They'll get there again. Give them time. Everyone wants to posture, go and meet the press, yell and scream, it's threatened, et cetera, but they'll get there. And so markets were fairly complacent. As of yesterday, the market said, you know what? Maybe they won't. First of all, we don't know what there means. We don't know what the X date is. So going back to Janet Yellen in early May, she said, well, the X date is June 1st. Well, that was a political stunt designed to put pressure on the Republicans. Hey, the clock's ticking. If you don't get this done by June 1st, the world's going to come to an end. The U.S. is going to default instead, although, as I said before, the U.S. has already defaulted lots of times. But it didn't work because the Republicans kind of know what I'm explaining to our viewers, which is no one really knows. Picking June 1st is just pulling a number out of a hat, number one. Number two, maybe you haven't used up all your bag of tricks. Maybe you got a few more rabbits you can pull out of the hat. And number three, we're not going to be pushed around. So now that we're really close to June 1st, I mean, the clock really is ticking. Oh, by the way, if the Republican House of Representatives and the White House actually agreed on something, you can't just push a button. It takes 4 or 5 days to do that at a minimum. That goes back to January when Kevin McCarthy was trying to get elected Speaker of the House. And the Republicans were like, no, remember, it took 15 votes. I think you got to go back 100 years to find a speaker who took 15 ballots, in other words, to votes to get elected speaker. But that was one where there was a gang of about 20, and plus the Freedom Caucus, they're not exactly the same, who were insisting on reforms from the Republican leadership. One of the reforms they wanted, they said, when you pass a bill of a certain importance, we want 48 hours or maybe 72 hours to read it. We don't, the stuff about, you're sitting there at midnight writing stuff in, and you put it on the floor and it's like, you got to vote now. Sorry, we'll remember Nancy Pelosi said, we'll tell you what's in the bill after you pass it. You got to vote for it to find out what's in it. And that's what they did. That was actually true. Republicans said, no more of that. If you want a bill, you got to put it, give us 2 or 3 days to read it, and then we can put it up for vote. Well, that's the rule in the House today. That's an important reform. What it means is that even if the White House and the House of Representatives agree, it's going to take 3 days. You got to follow your own rules. You're going to take 3 days to read it and then put it up for a vote. Then it's got to go through, a couple steps before it gets to a final vote. So figure 5 days, maybe more, but 5 days minimum from the time they come to an agreement to when they vote. Well, today's May 26th, and 5 days, May 31st. Oh, June 1st is the X date. It isn't really, but people are acting as if it is. So arguably we're out of time today. Like at midnight tonight, that's, even if you agreed, and I don't expect it, by the way, I do not expect an agreement today, maybe even tomorrow, maybe even beyond then. But bear in mind that if an agreement comes, tomorrow, the next day, or over the weekend. I think Congress left out, by the way, for Memorial Day weekend. But even if you got an agreement, you got to add 5 days to get it done procedurally. So we're already past June 1st. On May 26th, we are already past June 1st. We're past the X date, and Congress went home for Memorial Day. So now the market's like, hey, wait a second. Maybe all this June 1st stuff, and they always do it. Maybe it's not true. Maybe we are heading for a train wreck. Now, I'm not predicting the train wreck. I think they will get it done. They will not get it done by June 1st. There's a non-trivial probability that they won't get it done at all, that they'll, to appease the White House, you're going to lose the Freedom Caucus and the gang of 20 over in the House. Or if you keep those guys happy and women, the Democrats won't vote for it, or the Democrats in the Senate. Remember, this thing's got to get through the Senate also. The Senate has been quiet about all this, but you got to get a lot. You got to hurt a lot of cats to make this happen. There's no guarantee they'll do it. So I expect they will. They will not get it done by June 1st. They will not meet the X date. There's a chance, 20, 30%, who knows, that they won't get it done at all. And the markets are finally waking up. The bond market is just going nuts. Short-term interest rates. I mean, some of these treasury bills, I say short-term, I'm talking about 3-week bills, one month bills, the shortest maturity treasury are yielding 7%. When was the last time anybody got 7% outside of, junk bonds or something like that? That's US Treasury securities yielding 7% in some of these auctions. That's starting to, kind of percolate down the yield curve, where the 10-year note is yield to maturity is getting closer to 4%, which is huge. And stocks are getting nervous. They were seeing them down more. The stock market's kind of funny because there's this huge rally in NASDAQ on AI GPT. By the way, I'm happy to announce I've just reached a deal with to write a new book on the impact of GPT on capital markets. I'm not going to be doing chemistry or genetic sequencing. I'll leave that to others. But the impact of GPT, artificial intelligence, generative pre-trained transformer technology on capital markets, how the robots are taking over and they're going to start to play games with you. That'll be coming, starting that now, that'll be coming in 2024. It takes a while to write a book, but the markets are waking up to what's going on. So expect a lot more volatility. Stocks are probably going to go down. Interest rates are going to go up. The dollar is going to get stronger, at least for the short run, until this is resolved. So it's a kind of a crazy time. But every day that goes by, the stocks are going to get more and more nervous. But meanwhile, look at NASDAQ going up. Why? Because of AI. So you got this kind of schizo thing where NASDAQ's rallying on artificial intelligence, NVIDIA, Microsoft, and all that. But meanwhile, if you take out those couple, I know this is artificial, but take out those couple of stocks from the indices, the whole market is down. Year to date, Dow, S&P, and NASDAQ are down unless you add in the gains from artificial intelligence. That kind of, I know a lot about artificial intelligence, and it's a big deal, but that kind of looks bubbly. So you've got a declining market based on X-day debt ceiling fears with an AI bubble over here on the side. So it's really, really tricky ground. I want to reduce stock allocations, increase a cash allocation, just to kind of weather the storm. But a very, very difficult period, Matt. But markets were too complacent. And as of yesterday, they woke up, and you're going to see, I think, a lot of pressure on stocks because of everything we just described.
Yeah. I'll pull up this chart. We pulled this up before while you were on, Jim, in different months and times just to look at it, because this is, what we're looking at here. This is a 5-year S&P chart, so there is an uptrend here that's from, if this is bottoming out, but it's like, man, this has just been a rough, call it a year, 14 to 18 months, just rough up and down. And, if what you're saying is true too, it's like, man, we get a little pop here from AI and stuff. And then all of a sudden we get some more bad, we start heading back here. It's just chewing traders up. I know that.
Right. Matt, go to around April, May 2021, if you will.
Yeah. So this is April okay. 2021.
Okay, what's the level there? 41.59?
Yep. Right.
Okay.
Right where we are.
Where's the S&P today?
Right there.
Right. And I was go across.
It's 41.96.
41.96.
So
yeah.
It's very close.
The point is the S&P has gone nowhere in 2 years. Now it's went up and went down and up and down. Okay, volatility. And if you're a total genius, buy the dips, sell the peaks. But good luck doing that with any consistency. But the real bottom line is the S&P has gone nowhere in 2 years.
Yeah.
I don't hold myself out as a technical analyst. I'm a macro analyst, and we have Dan Amos, who's an incredible fundamental analyst. We do both. I look at fundamentals, and Dan looks at the macro. But fundamental macro analysis combined. That's what we do. Same thing with Zach Scheit. But I do look at charts. It's not that I ignore them. It's just but a technician would say, you've got resistance at 4,200, that the S&P can't get over 4,200. And it first hit there in April, May 2021, not 2022, 2021. We're still in the pandemic at that stage. So the S&P has really gone nowhere in 2 years. And now, given what we just talked about with the debt ceiling and everything we talked about, the war in Ukraine, the AI bubble, et cetera, that might be poised for a very sharp drop.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is setting up, this has been a topic we've covered, sort of like a lost decade and where we had, maybe we're 2 years into that lost decade. And just for anyone that's not up to speed on that thesis, it's the concept, back in the 70s, we just had this, a lot of the same things that are happening now. We had a bunch of the same forces against us. And it just led to 10 years where the S&P and the markets just didn't do anything, but they just chopped higher and lower. So if you're a buy and hold investor since May 2021, you are not any better off. You're worse off because there's been way more inflation. So you're worse off, but you just haven't made anything. And then if you're, I see some comments here and there over the days and weeks on Rickards Uncensored. It's frustrated about the markets, frustrated about picks, across a lot of paradigm publications and things that are going up and down. We've got a lot of people that are doing it right, but this right here, if we just go to, I guess I'll go to a 1 year, everything's nice and slow. I think I screwed everything up.
Well,
but this is, so here's the 1 year. It's look at this thing, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down.
It's basically sideways.
It's all sideways. It's just chopping people up. So
And by the way, Matt, there's episodes similar to this you referred to from 1969 to 1982. It's 13 years. The Dow Jones went nowhere. Now, same thing. It went up and down and up and down and up and down, but it was about 1,000 in 1969 and it was 1,000 in 1982. So that was 12 years, okay, or 13 years. The Nikkei in Japan, the leading Japanese index, has not regained its 1989 high. In 1989, December 31st, 1989, it had 40,000. It has not made it back to 40,000 in 30 years. In 1929, the stock market crashed. Everybody knows that because of the Great Depression, et cetera. When did the Dow Jones recover its 1929 high? The answer is 1954, 25 years. So this idea that you have these 25, 30-year periods where stocks just never get back to where they were, they happen. And you're right. We could be 2 years into a 10-year nothing burger, meaning going sideways, not even know it because we got 8 years to go.
Yeah. And we might be lucky if it's 10 years. It's not 25
well, that's
in that
that's
case.
Right.
So yeah, a lot of things to pay attention to here. Big moving pieces. Inflation's up, interest rates up. Are they going to get cut? Who knows? And then the markets are chopping people up. So we appreciate your insight on all this. Jim, we're running up against about an hour here. Why don't we just I'll give you the last words and just sort of, if there's any topic that we didn't cover here that you think is important for the next week or month that folks need to pay attention to, why don't we hit that? And then, plenty of stuff to digest here in these big moving pieces.
Sure. Well, first of all, I think we covered a lot of ground, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
We didn't even mention the 14th Amendment. That's Biden's safety valve. But unlike a lot of TV commentators, I actually am a lawyer. I have 2 law degrees. I can tell you, use of the 14th Amendment in this context is unconstitutional. That's not what the 14th Amendment says. But anyway, that's good. A good talking point for TV. Yeah, look, Matt, we covered a lot of ground, but I could think of 10 big topics we didn't even touch. China calling in loans around the third world. Germany's in a recession. A large group of countries continue to accumulate gold, and just kind of on and on and on. But we'll get to all that. But I did want to tease a little bit the upcoming issue of Strategic Intelligence. It's a monthly publication. It's what we call our front end. It's our flagship vehicle. We put it's the longest one. We put the most work into it. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in our back end where we make specific recommendations. And those are out continuously. But this Strategic Intelligence, the June issue coming out in a matter of days, I think it'll be out early next week, is a big one. I think it's going to be a landmark issue because we are looking at the BRICS. I mentioned the BRICS a little bit during the call, but this is beyond the talk stage at this point. A lot of BRICS, end of the US dollar, the BRICS are going to replace the US dollar. It's getting real. There's a big BRICS summit conference in early June. They've got 19 members on the waiting list. It's not just Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa anymore. 19 countries are knocking at the door. They're very likely to be admitted. That's why they call it BRICS Plus. Argentina, Iran, Turkey, Chile, and many other Central Asian republics. And they will join, at which point you're going to have more than half the global GDP, more than half the population of the earth, huge land masses, huge natural resources in this BRICS club. And it's going to set up to be the opposite of the G7 Western Washington Consensus Club. So you're going to have a bipolar world. Is going to be on your doorstep very soon. They have another summit conference in August. This is the Leaders Summit, meaning Putin, Xi Jinping, Lula of Brazil, Modi of India, and Ramaphosa of South Africa are going to be there in person. They're all going to be sitting around the table. Interesting twist on that. The International Court of Justice in The Hague, which is kind of like Western dominated, has issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin for war crimes or whatever in Ukraine, as if wars weren't nasty. And so does Putin get arrested when he gets off the plane in South Africa? To be continued. It's like I hate to make it a cliffhanger, but I'm sure that Russia will receive assurances, and Sergei Lavrov, who's the foreign minister, will get assurances that Putin will not be arrested. If he is for any reason, they may just kind of light up South Africa with some tactical nuclear weapons, not sure. But there's just a little side drama going on. But anyway, the summit is scheduled for August, late August, I think August 22nd. I'll check the exact date. But that's when the BRICS are going to announce this new world currency. And it is going to be backed by commodities and probably gold. They may have just kind of muddled through the commodity stage and said, you know what, it's too complicated because they're not uniform and there's so many, and how do you change the baskets and all? Let's just use gold. In other words, what they did at Bretton Woods. If that happens, first of all, that's going to be a viable currency if it's pegged to gold, number one. Number two, it's basically going to create huge demand for gold, because if you want this new currency, you're going to have some gold, or contribute gold to some new central bank. We don't know all the details, but we know a lot of what's going to happen, and that's teed up for late August. So this story is becoming very real, very fast. We're going to cover it all in depth in our June issue of Strategic Intelligence, coming soon.
Awesome. That's a great preview. I know behind the scenes, you've been talking about it, and a lot of your analysts, including myself, we're waiting for that first draft to come in just so we can get eyes on it. Because this is such, I mean, over the last several months, this is a huge story, and we got very real catalysts coming up in the next 3 months that could throw this thing into hyperdrive. So
definitely
we'll be on the lookout. All right, Jim. Well, we appreciate it. The sun is out there shining. We'll wrap it up in a bookend. The sun's shining. It's filling up your solar panels. Energy for the Memorial Day weekend. Thanks a lot for breaking down a lot of these heavy duty topics. And again, if you're home watching, we talked a little bit about charts and the markets and stuff, but what Jim talked about for the bulk of the call, Ukraine war, big deep state happening behind it, and then the debt ceiling. I mean, these are the things that are moving markets, and we're going to see that over the next weeks and months. So we appreciate it. So have a great holiday weekend, Jim. Thanks for everything.
Thanks.
All right. See you, everyone.